Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you to the Department of Greek and Latin at University College. It's a great honor and privilege for me to come here, which is a place that's somewhat mythical in my imagination as being a kind of mecca for theater studies. A disproportionate number of great scholars come from this college, including some of the great pioneers, Tom Webster, for example, or the late and much lamented Eric Handley, and of course Patricia Easterling, all great pioneers in the area that I spend most of my research time in. So thank you for that. Scholarship has treated our two greatest Athenian festivals very differently. The literature on the procession of the Panathenaea is vast. The literature on the parade of the Dionysia is minuscule. The standard handbook, Bigger Cambridge's Dramatic Festivals of Athens, gives little more than 2 pages to the parade. Recent scholarship on the parade in English makes a virtue of this neglect. Supposing it was rather a dull affair, they stress the procession's solemnity, formality, dignity, and imply that it was fully prescribed and rather dull. I will argue the opposite, that it was riotous, creative, and colorful. It was also perhaps the most interesting and intensely musical event in ancient Greece, with even more choruses than the lyric and dramatic contests that followed it. The Dionysia took place mid to late March, the beginning of Greek spring. By popular reckoning, the Dionysia marked the opening of the sailing season. Sailors, like farmers, used the stars as a guide. Both the agricultural year and the sailing season began with the evening setting of the Pleiades. That's about late March, early April. And it ended with their morning setting, which is late October or early November. Hence the ancient etymology of Pleiades from pleo, sail. Dionysus's connection with the agricultural year has been noticed, and I think overrated. In Athens, at least, he's less of a fertility god. His connection with shipping and commerce, on the other hand, is generally unnoticed and underrated. Theophrastus's chatterbox, a man who talks in cliches and links them together in a chain of hackneyed associations, connects cheap wheat, lots of foreigners, the beginning of the sailing season, and the Dionysia. Agriculture gets mentioned too, but only as a less vivid future conditional. Classical Athenians connected the sailing season with the Dionysia because the festival and its associated market were designed to attract merchants and foreign visitors. Together, they brought good things to alleviate the want and tedium of a long winter: food, money, unusual privileges, and entertainments. Indications are that the closure of the seas was for the most part strictly observed, bringing an end to maritime commerce and even military communication for a period of at least 4.5 months. As it coincided with the termination of agricultural activity, this had serious consequences for the Athenian food supply. The shortage was particularly acute in the 5th and 4th century, when more than half of the grain needed to feed the Athenian population was imported from overseas. With scarcity came price gouging. The price of grain rose sharply towards the end of the winter months, putting basic food supplies beyond the reach of many. The grain law of 374 attempted to alleviate the problem by requiring that a 12th part of the grain from Lemnos, Imbros, and Skyros be gathered in Athens just before the closure of the seas, and that it not be sold in the market before Anthesterion, the last month of winter, just before the Dionysia, and at a price agreed on by the people. The Dionysia offered one of the largest and busiest markets of the Eastern Mediterranean. With a resident population topping perhaps 150,000 and tens of thousands of visitors, Athens was an obvious destination for merchants selling the remnants of grain from the previous year's harvest. This was the end of a forced Lent, and it is not surprising to find that food and material goods are a major theme of the festival. It's important to contextualize the festival if one is to appreciate the role played by food in Greek comedy, and especially Old Comedy. Many of the fragments preserved by Athenaeus are little more than lists of food, some of them worked into wild deipnological fantasies. A favorite motif of 4th century comedy is the monologue of the cook, who announces his menu in dithyrambic flight. One cook delivers his menu in a paterson of probably only 2 breaths, consisting of nothing but a solid 2.5 pages of edibles. Sometimes the lists are rhapsodic. Hermippus, in a play called Stevedores, launches into a mock Homeric hymn to Dionysus, in which the god is praised as a merchant shipper. Tell me now, you muses who dwell in Olympus, how many good things Dionysus brings here to men in his black ship since the time he began to carry merchandise over the wine-faced sea. From Cyrene, silphium stock and oxhide, from the Hellespont, mackerel and every sort of salted fish, from Thessaly, barley and sides of beef, and the mange for the Spartans from Sitalces, and from Perdiccas a great many shipfuls of lies. The Syracusans provide pigs and cheese. There's a lacuna here, but the list goes on to include products that originate from cities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, from Carthage to Phoenicia. Most modern readers don't get the joke, and that's probably because there isn't one really. It seems to be mainly about sustaining the buoyancy of the audience with effervescent reminders of the festival's blessings. Even the performance of comedies themselves are metaphorically presented as meals for the eyes and ears of the spectators. Metagenes, for example, claims his comedy will feast the audience with many original side dishes, and Aristophanes backhandedly compliments Crates for comedies that provided a light but satisfying lunch, while he himself offers the Athenians the first taste of his new clowns. The first official act of the Dionysia is the parade. The parade is a sacrificial procession. Isocrates speaks of the city sacrificing as many as 300 cattle at a festival. Inscriptions recording the sale of the hides of sacrificed cattle permit estimates for the Dionysia. Peter Wilson calculates 200 cattle at the Dionysia paid for by the Athenians. An Athenian decree of 372 requires the allied city of Paros to bring a cow and a phallus to the Dionysia, since they happen to be colonists of the people of Athens. This requirement for cow and phallus is said to be traditional. We know, in fact, that colonists were to bring a phallus from a decree of 445 founding the colony of Brea. But the Paros decree is ambiguous about whether the requirement to bring a phallus to the Dionysia applies to them as a colony, which they are said to be, or as an ally, which they in fact are. The question may be purely academic. Athenian propaganda tended to conflate allies and colonists on the basis of the claim that the Ionian cities were all originally colonized from Athens. The greater Panathenaea offers a ready analogy. There we are certain that both colonies and allies brought a cow and a panoply for the procession. We should therefore estimate for the Dionysian parade at the height of the empire another 200 cattle. So 400 cattle, which represents a lot of food. 400 modern beef cattle would provide 1 kilo of meat each for about 110,000 people. Ancient cows were less beefy, apparently. But if we take McInerney's recent estimate of 200 kilos per classical Greek cow, we're still providing a kilo of meat for 80,000 people. Instructions for a 4th century distribution from Caressia on Chaos stipulate 1.25 kilos of meat per person. This would still give us a figure of 64,000 portions, much higher than most estimates for the Athenian male population of classical Athens. But we might suppose that the allies and colonists who brought some of the food along also had a share. Add to this privately sponsored sacrifices and offerings by publicly appointed liturgists called restaurateurs. A bull described as worthy of the god led the sacrifices, but all of these cattle participated in the parade and required escorts from beginning to end. The parade puts other consumables on display. Our sources name a distinctive bread unique to the parade, obol bread, and the processing of the loaves is evidently memorable. We have 3 depictions in late 5th to 4th century vase paintings. The loaves are painted white, suggesting that they are uncooked dough and that they will be roasted at the sacrifice with the meat. The bread is impractically large, probably bigger than appears here, since Phallic tells us a loaf could contain 157.5 liters of flour. This equates, by my calculations, to about 200 standard white tin loaves that you might buy at Sainsbury's. It makes one think of the 440-pound sausage paraded by the Butchers' Guild at the carnival in Königsberg in 1583. It will be eaten, no doubt. But in the parade, it's food for the eyes, huge food, edible theater. The obol carriers themselves are part of the fun. Photius tells us that the term obeliaphoroi could serve as a derogatory term for workers and rustics. This implies clowning and coarse humor. Ephippus found them amusing enough to make them the chorus of a comedy. If everyone who gets meat gets a quarter liter of bread, and we're feeding roughly 70,000, then at the height of the empire, we might want about 125 of the largest size of obol bread and 250 obeliaphoroi. The figures are unlikely to be precise, of course, but the impression is there was plenty of raw food. Other sources indicate that medics carried trays with honey cakes and water jugs, and citizens carried large wineskins. These were made from 2 whole goat skins, and on the analogy of the Madeiran borrachos here, which are still in use, they would have held about 50 to 70 liters, suggesting about 500 were needed if every diner got a half liter of wine. Edible abundance was accompanied by a display of wealth. The parade was especially associated with the glitter of gold and silver. The processing of wealth was a common theme to the larger festivals, and public stores had enough processional equipment that Thucydides lists them second among Athens' uncoined gold and silver reserves. The first 2 items in Plutarch's characterization of the Dionysian parade are the carrying about of golden objects and expensive clothing. From the sale of sacrificial hides, Lycurgus paid for processional equipment that included dedicated gold-spun clothing, jewelry, and baskets for 100 basket bearers. From an inscription, we know that at least some of this was used for the Dionysia. Though this is the only place we have a suggestion of more than 11 basket bearers in a single Athenian procession. The Dionysian parade offers 2 conspicuous examples of putting wealth on display. We know that the 1,225 lyric and dramatic chorusmen that were to perform in the Dionysian contest also marched in the parade. As choregos, Demosthenes ordered gold-spun gowns and golden crowns for every one of his 50 courtiers. The manuscript of Against Midias preserves the testimony of the goldsmith, who says that the ornaments were made specifically for the parade, not the performance in theater, but the parade. The testimony may be an ancient interpolation, but its assertion gets some confirmation from Satyrus's claim that Alcibiades took advantage of his choregia to appear in the parade in a stunning purple cloak. The case is paralleled by a 4th century decree from Eritrea that stipulates that all musical contestants are to march in the festival procession wearing the same costume that they will wear in the contest. The Dionysia took place early in the 9th Prytany, what Merritt called the end of the fiscal year, and what might just as easily be regarded as the beginning of the new fiscal year. Along with the resurgence in revenues from import, harbor, and market taxes, in the 9th Prytany, rents for leased public lands normally fell due. But most importantly, during the empire, allies brought tribute to the Dionysia. The tribute delivered by the allies was paraded and displayed in the orchestra. Because Isocrates mentions this procession in the same breath as the honoring of war orphans, it is sometimes assumed that this happened before the tragic contest when announcements were made. Isocrates' juxtaposition is, however, rhetorical and not temporal. The parading of the tribute is quite unlike the official announcements before the tragic contest. It's pure ceremonious display. Even allowing 6 days for the Dionysia, it seems impossible to find time for a separate procession, and we should consider it likely that this was part of the display of wealth that characterized the parade. Robitschek imagines a train of at least 500 men, each carrying 1 talent of money. The relief crowning the Cleonymus decree is generally supposed to show the jars and bags of money that the Allies deposited in the theater's orchestra. The reliefs on decrees, most reliefs on decrees, unlike other types of ancient reliefs, are often purpose designed to fit their content, and this decree introduced new rules regulating the delivery of tribute to the Dionysia. It's mainly because of the tribute that the Dionysia is being called Athens' imperial festival. Part of the function of the parade was to advertise the empire's power and solidarity. Meg Miller has brought attention to the way Athens, at the height of its empire, borrowed imperial ritual and symbolism from Persia. In the Persian Empire, the subject peoples, including the Ionians, delivered their tribute in a great procession on the day of the New Year's festival. In the same way, the subjects of the Athenian Empire, mostly Ionians, delivered their tribute, a cow, a phallus, and large sums of money, in the parade of the Dionysia. This imperial formula is all the more striking, given that at the end of the processional route, the parade wound around the Odeon, a building whose design was a direct imitation of the audience halls or apadanas in which the Persian king and satraps received tribute at Persepolis and other Persian capitals. If the many phalloi processed by the allies symbolize power, this does not exhaust the range of this most polysemous of symbols. The phallus is generally taken to be a fertility symbol. Fertility and agriculture, however, are not thematized in the use of the phallus in the parade or in the myths that explain it. The myths explaining the origins of the phallic rites in both Athens and Attica make it clear that the phallus symbolizes the divine madness that licenses the worshiper to transgress ordinary human laws with impunity. According to the Athenian myth, a missionary named Pegasus first brought the image of Dionysus Eleutherius from Boeotia to Athens. But when the Athenians rejected the god, he afflicted their genitals with an incurable disease. Delphi declared that the sole cure was for the Athenians to hold the god in all reverence. They therefore constructed phalloi, and with these paid homage to the god and made them a memorial to their suffering. And the modern literature sometimes describes this disease as impotence, but it's just the opposite. It's hyperpotency. The Icarian myth is more explicit. Dionysus gave the farmer Icarius a vine, grew it, harvested it, and he offered the juice to his neighbors. They drank it and felt the effects of wine for the first time. And overpowered, some of them fell into a stupor, and others of them into a drunken rage. Assuming that Icarius had given them poison, they murdered him. To avenge the murder, Dionysus appeared before the Icarians in the form of a beautiful boy, and he flirted with them until they reached the peak of excitation. And then Dionysus suddenly disappeared, leaving them in this unabated and lamentable state. Until an oracle advised them that to put a stop to their madness, the word madness is used, by fashioning, they had to fashion images of male genitals. Another myth says the same about satyrs, except that satyrs never found the cure. It's clear that the disease of the first myth and the madness of the second are equivalent, and that the symbol of this divinely inspired madness is the phallus. The Florence cup shows the ritual cure in progress and not yet complete. The Athenians are still acting out their madness, though now faded details and added red show that the phallus bearers commemorate their own state of divine inspiration. For the classical period, we have good evidence of two types of phallic choruses. There are the phallic choruses that are called phallophoroi, or phallus bearers that we see here, and then there are choruses that are called ithephalloi, or erect phalluses. And these are phallic clowns who sport a variety of phalloi just about everywhere except in the most obvious places. This ithephallus by the Berlin painter has a phallus coming out of his forehead, one attached to the end of his nose, you can just make out the stump there, and one whose tip we can see at his right shoulder, but which once belonged to a stick. This stick is the distinctive attribute of the ithephallus. Its absence on the lower fragment of the jar, in fact, indicates that despite the reconstruction, the upper and lower part of the figure do not go together, but belong to two identically costumed men. The jar originally represented a chorus of ithephalloi. Enough representations of phallus stick-bearing choruses survive to show that they have several features in common, like the boots called cathornoi, ivy-spotted garments, and often effeminately draped chitons. Aggression, verbal and physical, is characteristic of phallic performers. The historian Simos reports that the phallophoroi would rush forward at the crowd, threatening it with the phallus, and then verbally abuse whomever they wished. In this spirit, phallophoroi sometimes sport aggressive costume. Phalloi, placed like the horns of a black rhinoceros, or the poised knife with its phallic end held by this eccentric wild man with an extra cyclopic eye. From Demosthenes, we know that an aristocratic youth gang cultivating a reputation for righteous, thuggish violence appropriated the name ithephalloi. A certain amount of physical aggression was tolerated or expected. Demosthenes tells us of one Tesicles, who thought it fitting to join the parade carrying a leather strap. When he happened upon a personal enemy, he thrashed him with it. The revealing thing is that Tesicles pleaded not guilty to violent assault due to the influence of the parade and wine, and would have been excused the assault had it not been for a history of enmity between Tesicles and his victim that made the violence look more like premeditation than sort of random outburst one might expect on this occasion. Aeschines could just demonstrate the habitually good behavior of one Epicrates by claiming that he showed perfect control even at the parade of the Dionysia. Decrees honoring Ephes make special reference to their orderly conduct at the Dionysia, at the parade. Decorum and good order from any semi-organized group of young men was so far from being expected that the Athenians created boards called wardens of the parade and wardens of the choruses. Their task, we're told, was to make sure that choruses did not lose control. And it's not likely to be aimed at to restrain the choruses of Sophocles competing in the theater, but the many choruses of drunken and ritually stimulated men in the parade. Aeneas Tacticus tells us that on the day of their Dionysian parade, the Chians filled the city with armed guards to prevent rioting. The madness of Dionysus Eleutherius is mob madness. It's expressed by group indulgence in precisely the things one cannot or should not practice alone. Heavy drinking, rowdy behavior, sex in a symbolic sense, and choral music and dance. In this sense, he's a god of sociality, and his parade advertises the superior power of the group over the individual. The ritual aggression is in principle group aggression against individualism. It is a bonding ritual, which is why the Athenians were eager to involve their allies and their colonies. When the allies and colonies sent phalloi to Athens, they had also to send choruses to process the phalloi. In the Thutypus decree, it's expressly stated that the oxen panoply sent to the Panathenaea are to be accompanied by men who will process them, and this must be a fortiori true of the phalloi of the Dionysia. We can see from the Florence cup that the phalloi are large. They're carved monoxyls and heavy, requiring many hands to carry them. Greek art rarely shows the depth of a line, but comparative phallology, mixed with a little practical sense, suggests that we should imagine at least 6 men on the left side to balance the 6 men on the right. Analogous phallic processions performed in Japan require 5 relays of 12 to 16 men each, all aged 42 for some reason, in order to carry a 400-kilogram combination of shrine and phallus a distance of 1.5 kilometers. If we add the exarchos, the figure on the front up here, and various add-ons like the fellow riding the satyr or the man at the back, we give ourselves a chorus of 15, which is a good choral number. If we have about 15 men for phallus, and we multiply this by about 200, which is the number of allies at the height of the empire, it will give us 3,000 phallophoroi. Many more if we suppose that we have to have relays, as they do in Japan. There are other types of choruses that we need to add to the list, but the evidence for some of these is best approached by reconstructing our earliest evidence for the Dionysia. Dionysian themes suddenly become very popular in Attic art in about 570, 560 BC. And I'll argue that these themes are inspired by the creation of the Dionysia. The invention or reorganization of the Panathenaea, incidentally, can also be dated by inscription to precisely this time, about 570, 560. Other forms of Dionysus had been in Athens, or around in Athens since the Bronze Age. But Dionysus Eleutherius, the god of phalloi and choruses, does have a recoverable history. We can be confident that Dionysus Eleutherius was in Athens by the mid-6th century. The reason is architectural and iconographic. The earliest evidence of construction in the area of the sanctuary of Dionysus Eleutherius in the south slope of the Acropolis is this fragment, probably of an altar, which Simon dates as early as 550. On it, we have a scene characteristic of the god. 2 Ithyphallic satyrs, 1 playing pipes, and a Maenad, all dancing. But this kind of iconography can be traced back in Attic art a few more decades. Dionysus, satyrs, and Dionysian themes first suddenly appear in Attic art about 580, and then become extremely popular from 570, 560 onwards. And some subjects of particular interest stand out. The return of Hephaestus, for example. This is a mythic scene, but the remarkable thing, as scholars like Carpenter and Hedreen have shown, is that the mythic event is buried. It's lost within a festival procession. At times, it's very much less a mythical scene than a festival scene with some mythic content. On this frieze, for example, the narrative is continuous, but it is a scene of sacrificial procession in which the actual mythic narrative has to be sought out like a Where's Wally in a sea of figures. The procession combines humans and satyrs, and bovine and caprine victims, and even includes a man with a remarkably big head that suggests a mask. It ends, like the parade, with a huge feast. The very first known satyrs appear in Attic art, as I said, at this time. But although satyrs are generally shown to be intractable beasts, many early representations surprisingly show them in regimented and orchestrated files. 570 to 560 also coincides, of course, with our first evidence of phallus poles. Also, in 560, a series of over 20 vases begins that continues into the 5th century. They're often called beast riders or animal choruses, but sometimes they're just transvestites or men on stilts or old men who walk on their hands. What they have in common is elaborate costume, orchestrated movement, often a piper, and usually an arresting way of moving. The choruses usually move in a straight line. Dick Green speaks of these choruses as comedies and as seen in the theater. But there's no theater in Athens until about 500. What we see is a processional chorus, a fleeting entertainment with no narrative element. Painted letters on the altos psikter show the dolphin riders' song emanating from each one of their mouths. And what they say is, on a dolphin. There's not much more to be said, really. No hint of anything beyond what the costumes and movements make perfectly obvious. Among the iconographic motifs just examined, we saw satyrs moving in processions and in disciplined lines. The Demosthenes Scholion tells us that those who processed for Dionysus paraded in imitation of his retinue, taking on the appearance of satyrs, bacchae, and silines. In On the False Embassy, Demosthenes mocks Aeschines' brother-in-law, nicknamed Chaerebion, for not wearing a mask in the processions. We know from Aeschines' response that this referred specifically to the Dionysian parade. We might assume that Chaerebion is a spontaneous participant, like the father of Androtion, who, when prisoners were released to participate in the Dionysia, is said by Demosthenes to have joined the parade and danced in his chains. Between them, these passages provide good evidence that some citizens participated in a komos in the parade wearing satyr masks. Unfortunately, the late Christian Sorvino Inwood argued ingeniously, but wrongly, I think, that the stress here is on komadze and not on the mask, interpreting the passage to mean that Chaerebion's fault was to break the solemnity of the parade by behaving in a manner appropriate to another parade, the komos, an event that she took to be by an equally ingenious argument to refer to a small procession called the Introduction that took place before the Dionysia. I can't offer a point-by-point refutation of her very involved argument here. I hope at least by now to have shown you reason to doubt Servinu Inwood's premise, namely that the Dionysian parade was solemn, formal, and dull. The Scholiast, commenting on Chaerebion, tells us that people used to wear masks to mock others without shame. Mockery is, of course, an important part of the parade. Demosthenes and Menander use the word pompeia, meaning parade abuse, and pompeioin, to behave abusively like one in a parade. Both authors put these expressions in significant conjunction with another expression meaning the same thing, but literally translatable as from the wagon or from the wagons. Our lexica tell us that both expressions refer to ritual abuse of onlookers by people riding in wagons in a parade. They are, however, confused about which festival of Dionysus these wagons belong to, and name the Linnaea, 2 different days of the Antisteria, in addition to the Dionysia. This is because they link these expressions with various fanciful Hellenistic theories of the origins of drama, and on the festival attributions, these lexica are generally unreliable. Our one pre-Hellenistic source, Plato, speaks of Athenians at the Dionysia, drunk and misbehaving on wagons. Plato is not one of those authors who uses the term Dionysia generically to refer to any festival of Dionysus, but specifically to the Dionysia, and the reference here to Taras should remove all doubts. That city had a Dionysia, but no Antisteria and no Linnaea. Epigraphy indicates the use of wagons in the parade of the Dionysia by the 4th century at latest. Direct evidence for Athenian practice might have come from this intriguing early 3rd century inscription, which seems to discuss problems along the processional route, referring specifically to the Diplon and possibly to the Sacred Gate. But it's too fragmentary to allow us with confidence to connect the reference to the Phallic procession with the very plausibly restored 4-wheeled wagon 10 lines below. Indirect evidence does, however, come from the parade of the Dionysia at Delos, which was organized at a time when Athens dominated the island, and in most respects, it follows the Athenian model closely. There, several inscriptions detail the construction of the wagon, or phalagogeon, used to carry the phallus in the parade. An eyewitness tells us that the 60-meter high golden phallus at the Alexandrian Dionysia under Ptolemy II was carried on a 4-wheeled wagon. And the phallus in 2nd century AD Edessa was also carried by a 4-wheeled wagon, as shown here on the tombstone of a pet pig that got so excited when he saw the phallus wagon that he used it as his juggernaut. He got run over by it. There's a before and after picture. Before after. Inscriptions show that the wagon for the phallus at Delos was weighted with lead ballast, using the nautical term hermatidze. Because of the ballast, many have thought that the wagon was in fact drawn through a local river to make it look as if it was floating and the wagon was in some sense a ship. I suspect lead ballast is needed only because the phallus is very large and needs a counterweight to avoid it toppling over. The fact that the processional route had to be laid with planks shows that a steady ride was desired, and also perhaps that the wagon was a larger than standard gauge. But the use of nautical language is still interesting. Five Attic vases, produced at the end of the 6th century, show Dionysus and satyrs riding on a wagon, fitted out like a ship. Later antiquities, larger and more international festival economies seem to have required the magnificence of actual ships. By contrast, the images on the Attic skiphoi are very much wagons in the shape of ships, and unlikely to be called anything other than wagons in ancient texts. Even the Panathenaic ship is referred to as a cart, as late as the 1st century AD. In the case of the Tarquinian amphora, the vehicle is mythicized as an actual ship, but incorporates features of the ritual wagon, including the piper and the very mysterious wicker-like object at the back. Nobody's really identified. Since the 19th century, most scholars have connected these ship carts with the Anthesterium, because Philostratus and Aristides mention a sacred ship for Dionysus in 2nd century AD Smyrna, at a festival in the month of Anthesterium. But by the 2nd century AD, there is a promiscuous koine of Dionysian imagery in art, and so far as we can tell, a generic mixing of motifs in Dionysian processions. Parker rightly warns that striking ritual practices of the 2nd century AD are not usually best explained as survivals from an ancient Ionian heritage. For just as long, a minority of scholars have urged much stronger arguments for connecting the ship cart with the Dionysian parade. The ship cart is included in the procession of bull sacrifice on the Bologna skiffos and on the London skiffos. Bulls belong to large public sacrifices and are very much a feature of the parade of the Dionysia. The Anthesteria, by contrast, seems to have involved only private sacrifices, which could hardly avoid such pomp as the ship cart. There is, in fact, no public procession at the Anthesteria to which our images could refer. This was not, says Parker, a festival of public pomp and expenditure. The procession at the Anthesteria, connected to the sacred marriage of Dionysus and Galeon, seems excluded by the lack of wedding imagery. Our ship carts cannot be compared to the crus that supposedly shows children enacting the wedding procession of Dionysus and his bride in a chariot, and brides are conspicuously absent on the ship cart. Aristophanes' Frogs mentions komoi in relation to the last day of the Anthesteria, but these also appear to have been without formal organization or elaborate spectacle. Some object that Dionysus Eleutherius did not come to Athens by ship, but over land, came from the ocean after all. But the ship is a symbol, not historical reconstruction. In part, it suits the Athenian Dionysus, because as we saw, he brings for his festival food and wealth from overseas. But there's something deeper. The utopic vision inspired by the Athenian carnival is one of things suddenly arriving and moving spontaneously under the influence of Dionysus. In the messenger speeches of Euripides' Bacchae, the presence of Dionysus is revealed by spontaneous springs of wine, milk, and honey, by the spontaneous coordination of the Bacchantes' movements, and by their miraculous energy and equilibrium as they rushed about with great weights on their heads. Their effortless coordination and equilibrium is an expression of the processional god. Dionysus sets people and things in motion, particularly in a graceful and rhythmic motion. The power of music is perhaps the supreme expression of this particular aspect of the god. When in the Bacchae, Dionysus appears in answer to the Bacchantes' invocation, the entire mountain reveled along with them, and the beasts. Nothing remained still. Plenitude also means that both animate and inanimate nature is filled with the god and made to move automatos, with no effort of the individual will or body. It's for this reason that the earliest processional technology, perhaps the first truly sophisticated machines, were created for the Dionysian parade. Herodotus tells us that the Egyptians invented the phallic procession as well as phalloi that can be made to waggle up and down. These soon became customary in Greece, according to Herodotus and others. The moving phalloi came to be named string puppets. The fulcrum, below the satyr's hands, the pulleys and counterweights, indeed the whole arrangement of the phallus on the Florence cup seemed designed to create a phallus for the satyr that in one position is his and in another position is one he rides on. Let's see if I can do this right. Yeah, I did. Others have shown that epigraphically detailed axles, pivots, and pins among the components of the icon of Dionysus and Delos make it clear that it had movable parts. It was fitted with wings and must have flapped. In fact, we have a relief showing the icon of Dionysus as a cock with a phallic head, and are surely to imagine it flapping its wings, rising up and crowing at climactic moments in the procession. This chicken icon also appears on the cart at Edessa, but you see that it is flat in the cart, maybe because it bumped over a pig, but I think probably, probably more likely because it also is meant to suddenly jump up and start crowing at important moments. But the most brilliant automata are attested for Dionysian processions in the early Hellenistic period. In 308, when Demetrius of Phaleron was archon in Athens, he organized a particularly magnificent parade for the Dionysia. An eyewitness tells us that he particularly prided himself that a giant mechanical snail moving of its own accord, automatos is the word used, led the parade for him, leaving a trail of slime. The whole route of the parade, which is not very straight, it's quite a feat. Automata of this sort are also mentioned in the great procession for Ptolemy, Philadelphus. They included, among other marvelous floats, a 12-foot tall personification of Dionysus's nurse, Nyssa, on a cart drawn by 60 men, which he says, stood up mechanically without anyone laying a hand on it, and after pouring a libation of milk, sat down again. Demetrius's snail and Ptolemy's Nyssa suggest that the playful and innovative spirit of Dionysian parades was the origin of this kind of miraculous spectacle technology which reached such brilliant heights in the Roman and Byzantine period. Ships differ from wagons in that they can be moved by external forces. They are ideal floats in the fullest sense for a Dionysian procession. And even when real ships need to be moved by human power, they're moved by oarsmen who keep a rhythm that in ancient Greece was often accompanied by pipe music. It is the music and free movement of the ship that makes it Dionysian and a suitable setting for the invention of choral dance. That some Greeks processed Dionysus in a ship by the early 6th century is suggested by the surviving Homeric hymn that tells this myth. It brings together an epiphany of the god, a ship, and men transformed into dancing animals, representing the original and first human chorus for Dionysus. The hymn to Dionysus describes grapevines and ivy replacing the rigging of the pirate's ship in a way that suggests familiarity with the kind of ship cart imaged in Attic iconography. The ship carts are no earlier than about 510, but the Attic black-figured cup by Exechius suggests that the Dionysian ship may have been known in Attica by about 530. I wonder if we can add Dionysian ships to our list of subjects in Attic pottery inspired by the parade. The missing link between phallus wagons and ship carts is provided by vase fragments produced by Greek potters and painters resident in Egypt around 560. When the Greek cities began to have grand procession, it's very easy, at least for me, to believe that they borrowed much of their basic know-how from the Egyptians, whom the Greeks generally regarded as geniuses in religious matters. Egyptian priests had long processed Ammon, Osiris, Hathor, and Horus in sacred ships, and ship carts are also known from Egyptian terracottas. Now this is not a float from an Athenian procession, but it does give us a snapshot of how a Dionysian ship was conceived by Egyptianized Greeks at the very time that Athens cobbled together its Dionysian parade, partly out of originally Egyptian forms. Of particular interest is the way the Karnak fragment unites aspects of the phallophoria with aspects of the Dionysian ship. The ship carts are associated with satyrs. It is satyrs who man the carts and provide the music, and also pull the cart along. These are doubtless the counterparts of the satyr choruses, and the abusive men on the wagons attested for the Athenian parade, and they're obviously very drunk. It puts in context Demosthenes' complaint that the Athenians made Midias a cavalry commander, even though he was incapable of riding a wagon across the marketplace during the parade. Literally, he fell off the wagon with drink. But satyrs also ride upon the Karnak ship, and we have the remnants of a pair of pipes suggesting a satyr playing music in much the same posture as on the Attic ship carts. On the other hand, the Dionysian ship has things in common with the Florence phallophoroi. This includes the manner in which both are carried, and people have noticed the keel-like curvature of the phallus that serves as the base of the float. But the most important similarity is surely the presence on the Karnak ship of satyrs, or satyrs in Comas, who ride upon phalloi. The acrostolion of the ship is shaped like a phallus with a characteristic horse ear and an eye spot that we find on the Florence phallos. A smaller satyr rides a phallic projection on the figurehead while suggestively attaching a double-headed phallus to his rump. The phallic motifs should associate the ship's Athenian counterparts with the Dionysia, since the Linnea and Anthisteria involve no phallic ritual, and in fact, no phallic motifs appear in the art that's related to these festivals. I'll now urge a few conclusions upon you. The most important is that the Dionysian parade was not dull, solemn, formal, or particularly dignified. It was, on the contrary, an exercise in the representation of a golden age plenitude, chock full of such irresistible contents as food, drink, money, music, dance, unbridled fantasy, and unbridled license, all of which are presented or represented in dazzling abundance. The object was to fill the parade route with enough to drown eye and ears with color, movement, and sound, and to stun the mind with the sudden bounty of Dionysus. It was no small affair. If you were to ask me to stage a replica of the parade, based on the evidence I know and making a few wild guesses, but I hope intelligent ones, I would need over 8,000 people, including possibly hundreds of performing choruses, phallophoroi, ilthiphalloi, beast and beast rider choruses, satyrs, freelance participants, many brilliant wagons and floats, and I'm not even including the sacred and civic officials who are said in the recent scholarship to make up almost entirely the whole parade. The second conclusion is that several series of vase paintings suggest that something took place between 570 and 560 BC to inspire vase painters to represent Dionysian scenes, and in particular, motifs drawn from a Dionysian procession, including choruses, costumes, drunkenness, ribaldry, and phalloi. Features that come together only in the Dionysian parade. This something, I would argue, is the creation of the Dionysia. A last conclusion, or suggestion as a subject perhaps for another lecture, is the degree to which the theology of Dionysus Eleutherius arises out of this ritual. His character as the god who comes and suddenly disappears, his ships, his phallic nature, his strong connection with sacrifice, with music, with dance, and indeed with processions. If, for example, we were to look at the physiognomy of satyrs, we could immediately link it to ideas about the prey. The big eyes for taking in the spectacle, big ears for the music, and rapt attention for the amazing displays. The fact that satyrs are generally drunk, musical, phallic. The fact that satyrs combine the wildness of uninhibited nature with the civilized regimentation of the dance. But most of all, the fact that, like the prey, they are gregariously plural, fill all available space with interesting antics, and like the prey, are always in perpetual motion. The prey, one could argue, created the Athenian Dionysus. It gave definition to the power he exerted upon his worshippers and gave visual representation to his gifts of exuberance and plenitude.